can still remember the way the cold air cut through my lungs that morning in the Adirondacks. My brother Matthew and I had planned the trip for months, longing for an adventure in the pristine winter wilderness of upstate New York. We wanted to test our limits, to push ourselves beyond the confines of our everyday routines. But we had no idea that our little escapade would turn into a fight for survival. The drive up had been uneventful, the roads mostly clear despite the foreboding forecast of an incoming storm. We reached the trailhead just past noon, our backpacks heavy with supplies for a week's worth of winter camping. At first, the conditions seemed manageable. Fresh powder on the ground, the crisp scent of pine in the air, and a slight breeze that whispered through the treetops. We trekked 2 miles to a site near a frozen lake, set up our tent, and gathered wood for a small fire. The first night was magical. The sky was so clear that you could see every star, and we stayed up late talking about childhood memories, future plans, and our families back home. The following day, the temperature dropped drastically. The ranger at the station had warned us about a cold front, but neither of us expected the dramatic plunge. We were well equipped: thermal sleeping bags, insulated clothing, a stove for hot meals, but the cold seeped into our bones nonetheless. By the second night, the storm arrived in full force. Snow came in thick flakes, swirling relentlessly in the gusty wind. We huddled together inside the tent, listening to the wind howl like some wounded animal. On the third morning, we woke to a nightmare, a massive tear in the side of our tent. At first, we thought the wind had done it. Then we noticed the paw prints. They circled our campsite, large and unmistakable. A black bear had come snooping in the middle of the night. Our food was in a sealed container, but evidently the bear had caught the scent. We quickly checked our supplies. It seemed the bear had only managed to claw through some of our extra trail mix. Still, the knowledge that a bear was nearby frayed our nerves. By midday, the snow was knee-deep, and the wind was picking up again. We debated packing up and heading back, but the weather reports we'd managed to catch on Matthew's small radio indicated the storm would worsen by nightfall. We had to leave immediately, or risk being stuck another 3 or 4 days in these brutal conditions. We made our decision: break camp, head for the trailhead, and cut our trip short. As we were gathering our gear, however, the bear returned. It happened so fast that the details still blur in my mind. A low growl from the tree line, a flash of black fur. We yelled, banged pots, tried everything we'd ever read about scaring off bears. For a moment, the bear seemed uncertain, wavering on its hind legs. Matthew fired off a warning shot with the flare gun we carried for emergencies. The bear roared, backing off, and we took the chance to abandon everything but the essentials. We each grabbed our packs, stuffed with whatever survival gear we could manage: maps, water, a little food. Then we ran. Running in the heavy snow was a special kind of torture. My lungs burned with each step, and the biting wind slapped my face raw. We veered off the main trail to confuse the bear, climbing higher toward a ridge. Over the howling wind, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Matthew led the way, checking our compass periodically, but the visibility was abysmal. Snow whipped in every direction, obscuring the path ahead. Hours passed, and the daylight began to fade. Every part of me ached, my calves from trudging through drifts, my shoulders from the pack, my hands, despite the thick gloves. Matthew's face was white with exhaustion, and I knew mine must have looked the same. The storm was relentless, and we had no choice but to find shelter soon. We stumbled upon a rocky overhang that offered a bit of protection from the wind. There we tried to set up a makeshift shelter with a tarp and some rope. Our small propane stove sputtered, and we managed to melt some snow for water. My fingers trembled as I held the canteen. I forced down the warm water, grateful for a momentary reprieve from the cold slicing through my throat. Night fell fast. Without enough wood to keep a fire going, our only option was to huddle together under the top. We put our sleeping bags side by side, the last line of defense against the plummeting temperature. My mind was still reeling from the day's events, but Matthew's presence brought a measure of comfort. I remember him telling me it would be okay, that we just needed to tough it out until sunrise. I nodded, trying to believe him. Sometime in the night, the temperature must have dropped even lower. I awoke shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they'd crack. Matthew was still, far too still. I shook his shoulder. He didn't respond. I panicked, fumbling for my flashlight. Its weak beam fell upon his face. I'll never forget how pale he looked, like a statue carved from ice. His lips were blue, and his eyes were half open, glazed over with a faint film of frost. I called his name, my voice echoing against the dark walls of rock. No reply. There's a kind of desperation that sets in at that moment. I tried everything, rubbing his hands, his chest, breathing into them to warm him, calling out to him over and over. Tears froze on my cheeks. I'd never felt so helpless. As I pulled him close, I realized there was no heartbeat. The cold had claimed him during the night while I slept inches away. The storm still raged, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath that rocky ledge. I wanted to carry him down the mountain, but even standing was a struggle. I was weak, my body teetering on the edge of hypothermia. Still, I refused to leave Matthew behind. Gathering what remained of my strength, I hoisted him onto my back. Step by agonizing step, I descended, barely able to see a few feet ahead. My numb fingers clutched his coat, determined not to lose him in the drifts. I can't say how long I wandered. Eventually, my foot caught on a buried root, and I tumbled forward. When I rose, I couldn't lift him anymore. My body simply shut down. I sank into the snow, pressing my forehead against his for a final goodbye. Then, with tears burning my eyes, I staggered onward alone, promising him I'd make it out and tell everyone what a hero he'd been. Rescue found me hours later. A search party of local rangers and volunteers who'd braved the blizzard after we missed our check-in call. Delirious and half-frozen, I babbled incoherently about Matthew, the bear, and the storm. They brought me down the mountain, put me in a warm bed in the small hospital near Lake Placid. I survived, but only just. Now, every winter, I return to that place and bring a small wreath. I lay it near the trailhead, where the pine trees stand tall and silent against the snow. It's my tribute to Matthew, who gave everything so that I might live. The Adirondacks have never felt the same. That day, they took my brother, and a part of me I can never get back. My wife, Linda, and I had been saving up for this trip for years. A quaint, snow-covered cabin in the mountains of Colorado, just big enough for our family of 5. We wanted a taste of the rustic life, even if only for a week. The rental listing had boasted breathtaking views, a quiet location, and easy access to nearby hiking trails. It seemed like the perfect getaway from the hustle and bustle of our daily lives. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks. The cabin was picturesque, a steeply pitched roof draped in snow, a little porch overlooking a frozen creek, and a sturdy fireplace inside that promised warm nights together. Our 3 kids, David, 14, Chloe, 12, and Sam, 9, were thrilled to be out of the car. They raced around the property, throwing snowballs and marveling at the towering pine trees. The first couple of days passed in peaceful bliss. We took short hikes, built snowmen in the yard, and roasted marshmallows over the crackling fire each evening. The only minor inconvenience was the occasional sputter of the old furnace, but the cabin's caretaker had assured us it was normal. We had no reason to doubt him. On Sunday afternoon, David and Chloe asked if they could explore the woods behind the cabin. It was still daylight, and the property was fenced on 3 sides, with the forest beyond. Linda and I gave them permission, warning them not to go too far and to be back before dusk. They bundled up in their winter coats and boots, giggling as they headed out the door, determined to find hidden paths or animal tracks. About an hour later, I was working on some hot cocoa in the kitchen when I heard frantic pounding on the cabin door. I opened it to find David and Chloe standing there, breathless and wide-eyed. Their cheeks were flushed, not just from the cold, but from raw panic. They spilled inside, talking over each other in an avalanche of words. It took me a moment to calm them down enough to get a coherent story. What they told me was terrifying. They'd gone a bit deeper into the woods than planned, following a set of strange footprints. Soon they stumbled upon an old shack, nothing more than rotting planks and a sagging roof, David said. But there was a weird smell in the air, and faint smoke escaping from a crooked metal pipe jutting out the side. Chloe peeked through a grimy window and saw a clutter of mismatched containers and a makeshift stove or burner in the corner. A pungent chemical stench hung in the air. She didn't understand what it was, but David recognized some references from health class. Meth labs or drug labs, he said. They realized they shouldn't be there. That's when they heard footsteps crunching in the snow. A man wearing some sort of protective jumpsuit, gloves, and a respirator mask emerged from behind the shack. He spotted them instantly. David said the man shouted something garbled before lunging toward them. The 2 of them turned and ran, branches clawing at their jackets, hearts thundering in their chests. They glimpsed the man chasing after them, his mask reflecting the pale winter sunlight like a sinister bug-eyed creature. They managed to stay ahead, weaving around trees until they reached the edge of our property. The man slowed, but didn't stop. He stood there, just beyond the fence, as though he was deciding whether to follow. His mask hid any emotion, but Chloe said she could hear his labored breathing behind that mask, like something from a horror movie. Then he turned around and marched back into the woods. I felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. Drug activity wasn't something I'd ever expected to encounter during a family vacation. Linda, who had been listening from the hallway, immediately began packing bags. We both agreed we needed to leave. There was no way we could stay there another night, not with the kids in this state of fear. The caretaker hadn't mentioned any concerns about illegal activities in the area, but maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he chose not to tell us. We scrambled to get our things together. I went outside to load the car, scanning the perimeter of the trees for any sign of movement. The shadows were long, the sky darkening as evening approached. The wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. My gut told me we were being watched, though I saw no one. By the time we had everything in the SUV, it was nearly dark. I ushered the kids in, told them to buckle up, and hopped behind the wheel. Linda sat next to me, silent and tense. The moment I started the engine, the headlights illuminated a figure standing about 50 yards away, near the tree line. He had on what looked like the same protective suit David had described. I felt an icy stab of fear. Without hesitation, I shifted into drive. That's when the first shot rang out. I heard the crack of a firearm, and the rear window exploded in a spray of glass shards. The kids screamed. Linda ducked down, pulling Sam with her. I floored the gas, the tires spinning momentarily before finding traction on the snowy ground. Another shot ricocheted off the side panel, leaving a deep dent. My heart pounded like a jackhammer as we sped down the winding driveway that led to the main road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of that masked man, now partially silhouetted by the flash of muzzle fire. It sent a jolt of adrenaline through me that kept me driving well past any posted speed limit. The kids sobbed, and Linda tried to calm them while I navigated the treacherous mountain road. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Would he follow us? Would there be more of them? Who could we call for help? We didn't stop until we reached a small town 20 miles away, where we found a police station. I parked outside and we hurried inside, still shaking. We reported everything: the shack, the chemical smell, the man in the protective suit, the shots fired at our vehicle. The officers took down every detail, but we never heard if they caught the man or dismantled that drug lab. Their immediate concern was our safety, and they arranged for us to stay in a nearby motel under watch while they investigated. We left Colorado the next morning, the kids too, traumatized to even think about finishing the vacation. In the weeks that followed, we tried to piece our nerves back together. David would wake up sweating from nightmares about someone chasing him through the woods. Chloe refused to sleep without a light on. Sam barely said a word for days. Looking back, it still gives me chills. All those brochures promised a winter wonderland, but we found a nightmare hidden in those silent, snowy mountains. The most important thing is that we got out alive. And though the kids may never want to step foot in a cabin again, I'm just thankful no bullet found its mark that night. I was driving along a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of a fierce snowstorm, the kind that reduces visibility to just a few feet. It was late, close to midnight, and I was on my way home from a business trip up north. The roads were nearly empty, which was both a relief, no traffic to crawl behind, and a concern, because if anything happened, help would be far away. I had just passed a sign reading "Next town 30 miles" when I saw her. A figure on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by my headlights. She was waving her arms wildly, and the frantic motion made me slow down. As I inched closer, I noticed she was in rough shape. A gash on her forehead, blood matting her hair, and a look of sheer panic on her face. I rolled down the passenger window a crack, just enough to speak. "Are you okay? What happened?" She practically threw herself at the window, pleading for help. She claimed her boyfriend had beaten her and dumped her on the side of the road. My instincts told me to be cautious. Picking up hitchhikers in a storm can be risky. But my conscience wouldn't let me drive away from someone clearly injured. I unlocked the passenger door, helped her in, and handed her some tissues to staunch the bleeding. As she settled into the seat, she kept glancing behind us, as if expecting someone to appear out of the swirling snow. Her voice trembled, and she repeated the same story. She and her boyfriend had a fight. It got physical. He beat her, then kicked her out of their car. I told her I'd call the police and an ambulance, but she practically shrieked, "No cops! Please, just take me to the nearest hospital." That was the first red flag. Why wouldn't she want the police involved if she was a victim of assault? But I tried to be sympathetic, rationalizing that maybe she was scared or had had bad experiences with law enforcement. Still, the pit in my stomach grew. She kept fidgeting, her eyes darting around my car. Every now and then, she'd mutter things under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. I noticed a faint odor of alcohol on her breath, mixed with something more pungent, maybe gasoline or chemicals. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I drove. The storm made it impossible to go fast, and it felt like time was stretching out uncomfortably. We must have driven for 10 minutes when I noticed her story changing. She mentioned a different name for her boyfriend than she'd first used. The sequence of events got jumbled too. First she said he pushed her out of the car, then she said she jumped out. I tried to pin down details, but each question seemed to irritate her more. Finally, she snapped at me. "Stop asking questions and just drive." I glanced at her. Her hand rested ominously near her coat pocket. I couldn't tell if she had a weapon. but the tension in the car was thick as ice. I silently cursed myself for not calling the police right away. I decided that at the next sign of civilization, I'd stop and make an excuse to get out of the car and call for help. The highway was empty, the snow piling up around us in suffocating drifts. Suddenly, she let out a high-pitched laugh, the sound grating and unnatural. She slapped the dashboard and began ranting about how I was driving too slowly, how she needed to get away before they found her. I asked who they were, but she just stared at me, eyes wide, as if I'd asked the dumbest question in the world. In the glow of the dashboard lights, I saw her pupils were dilated, her face flushed. She seemed both panicked and strangely excited. That's when she lunged for the steering wheel. The car swerved violently, and I nearly lost control. "What are you doing?" I shouted, wrestling to keep the wheel steady. "We'll crash!" She screamed something incoherent, then reached for me. I managed to push her back into her seat, but she clawed at my jacket, her nails raking across my shoulder. The smell of blood from her head wound mingled with the stale air in the car, making me queasy. My adrenaline surged. I considered slamming on the brakes, but we were on a slick highway in a whiteout. One wrong move and we'd skid into a ditch, or worse. She kept babbling about needing to get to a hospital, but she was the one preventing us from driving safely. I realized she wasn't just a victim, she was unstable, possibly psychotic or high on something. We reached a small rest area turnoff, and I seized the chance. I pulled off the highway, the tires crunching over icy gravel. "I need to check the tires," I lied. "We can't keep going like this." The moment I shifted into park, she grabbed the door handle. Rather than fleeing, she lunged at me again, this time aiming for my face. Her fingernails scratched my cheek, drawing blood. Instinct took over, and I shoved her with enough force that she tumbled out the open door into the swirling snow. She landed awkwardly on her side, still screaming. I slammed the door shut, hit the lock, and jammed the accelerator. The car fishtailed, but then caught traction, speeding back onto the dark highway. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her running after me, but the rest area disappeared behind a curtain of white snow. I drove for another few miles, then pulled into a gas station, hands shaking on the wheel. I called the state police and explained everything: the woman on the side of the road, her claim of domestic abuse, her erratic behavior, and the attack. An officer arrived about 15 minutes later. While I gave my statement, he received a dispatch. A wrecked car had been found about a mile from where I'd picked up the woman. Inside was the body of a man, presumed to be her boyfriend, dead from the impact of the crash. No signs of a beating or assault. It seemed she'd fabricated the story, possibly to avoid the blame for the accident. The police told me they'd been looking for a lone female driver who fled the scene of a fatal crash hours earlier. She must have concocted the lie, hoping to hitch a ride to the hospital or anywhere else safe before the cops traced the wreck back to her. And in her unhinged state, she'd become violent when I asked too many questions. Even now, whenever I drive that lonely stretch of highway, I get a chill. I think about her wide eyes, the blood on her face, and the way she laughed in the darkness. The storm that night was fierce, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside that woman. Sometimes it's not the elements you have to fear on a snowy road. It's the people you encounter along the way. I was only 7 years old when it happened, but the memories remain as vivid as if they occurred yesterday. My village, a small, nameless dot on the map near the northern coast, where fishing boats occasionally anchored for rest, was a tight-knit community. No more than 50 souls lived there, each of us reliant on the sea's bounty for survival. In winter, the winds whipped across the bay, and the snow piled high against the crooked wooden houses. But life was peaceful, and I felt safe. That changed one bitterly cold December. People started getting sick. At first it seemed like a bad flu. Coughing fits, high fevers, aches and chills. But soon, more alarming symptoms appeared. Skin turning ashen, eyes bloodshot, lips cracking and bleeding. My father was the first in our home to succumb. I remember him shivering so violently that the whole bed rattled. My mother tried everything: herbal remedies, warm broths, compresses. Nothing worked. In a matter of days, the illness spread like wildfire through the village. The adults were worst hit, but even some children showed signs. Pale faces, trembling limbs. I felt odd too, a persistent ache behind my eyes, a chill that wouldn't go away. But compared to everyone else, I remained remarkably stable. My mother clung to me whenever she could, tears always close to the surface. "You'll be fine," she whispered, trying to reassure me, and perhaps herself. As the snowdrifts grew deeper outside, a grim hush settled over our village. People were too weak to venture out unless absolutely necessary. The fishing boats lay idle by the frozen docks. Cries and coughs echoed through the still air. One by one, my neighbours closed their doors against the bitter winds, retreating into their homes. A few made desperate attempts to reach the nearest town, but the roads were buried under feet of snow. There was no way out, no way in. I remember the day my father died. He'd been delirious, calling out names from his childhood, shivering under a pile of blankets. I was in the corner of the room, hugging my knees, when I heard his ragged breathing slow, then stop. My mother wailed, a sound that still haunts my dreams. She and I wrapped him in one of his old fishing nets, a makeshift shroud. We couldn't even give him a proper burial. The ground was too hard, the storm too fierce. So we laid him in the small shed behind our house, tears freezing on our cheeks. Not long after, my mother began to show the same symptoms. Her skin took on a grey hue, her eyes dull. She tried to remain strong for me, forcing a smile as she offered me a piece of stale bread. But I saw the hopelessness in her gaze. By then, the village was nearly silent. The once cheerful sounds of laughter, the calls of fishermen returning at dusk, gone. All that remained was the keening wind and the occasional cough that echoed from behind closed doors. One night, I awoke to find my mother gasping in the darkness. She reached for my hand, clutching it with all her remaining strength. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the window. I watched the life drain from her eyes, powerless to stop it. I didn't cry then. I was too numb, too worn out from days of worry and fear. Instead, I sat there, holding her hand until it grew cold in mine. Somewhere in the following days, I've lost track of exact times and sequences, I realized I was the only one still moving around. I wandered the village in a daze, knocking on doors. No one answered. Inside each house, I found the same scene. Families huddled together in the final stillness of death. The disease had claimed them all. My mother, my father, my friends. Everyone was gone. Hunger gnawed at me. The pantry in our house was nearly empty, so I scrounged around for anything edible in the other homes. Mostly I found dried fish or moldy bread, which I ate with a blank mind, too hungry to care about taste. At night, I slept wherever I could find warmth, a bed here, a corner by a dying hearth there. The loneliness pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. In the howling wind, I sometimes thought I heard voices calling my name, but whenever I opened a door or turned a corner, there was only silence. I don't know how long I lived like that. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of cold, hunger, and despair. Then, one morning, everything changed. A loud horn blared from the docks, the sound echoing off the snowy hills. I rushed outside, nearly stumbling in the deep drifts. At the edge of the pier was a fishing boat I'd never seen before, battered by the storm, yet miraculously afloat. A tall man in a thick coat stood on deck, his eyes scanning the abandoned settlement. He called out, his voice booming across the frozen water. I summoned all my strength and waved my arms, tears of relief streaming down my face. He spotted me immediately and brought the boat closer, navigating around broken ice floes. When he finally stepped onto the rickety dock, he looked around in horror. Corpses lay in the shadows, half buried by snow. The air itself seemed sick with the lingering disease. He covered his nose and mouth with a scarf, then scooped me into his arms. I don't remember his exact words, but I do recall the warmth of his coat, the smell of salt and fish, and the reassurance in his eyes. That fisherman saved my life. He told me later that he'd stopped to look for extra supplies, fuel, maybe some food before sailing farther south. Never did he expect to find an entire village wiped out by some unknown plague. He took me aboard, cared for me, and eventually delivered me to a proper medical facility. As chance would have it, I recovered fully. The illness didn't claim me like it did the others. Maybe I had a natural immunity, or maybe it was sheer luck. All these years later, I'm still haunted by the memory of that silent village, the snowfall burying empty streets, the lonely creaking of doors swinging in the wind. The disease remains unidentified. Doctors speculated it could have been a mutated strain of influenza or a toxin introduced by something we ate, but no conclusive answer ever emerged. I often wonder why I was spared when everyone else perished. Some nights I dream of my mother's last words or my father's final breath. Other nights I dream of footprints in the snow leading away from the village, footprints I never followed. Perhaps, in some alternate reality, another survivor walked away before the storm hit full force. But I'll never know. What I do know is that survival came at a cost. The fisherman who found me gave me a second chance, but he couldn't give me back what I'd lost. The warmth of family, the security of home, the innocence of childhood. I'm an old man now, and every winter, when the first snow falls, I'm carried back to that frozen village, where the wind howled and life slipped away in the dark. It's a reminder that nature can be merciless, disease can strike without warning, and sometimes fate spares a solitary soul for reasons unknown.